The book is about two things. It's about the bait and switch that characterizes the place of workers in American democracy. On the one hand, they're enticed by the promise of the American dream, and on the other hand, they're thwarted in their attempt to achieve that dream through collective power, namely through their unions. And, you know, the classic bait and switch example in the realm of public policy is the right to work. Okay? So the right to work promises to protect the right of workers to form a union in their workplace, but it also prohibits workers from requiring their fellow co-workers from actually financially supporting the union. Okay? So you can form a union, but you can't fund it, right? So the second thing that the book is about is the origins of those types of laws, of right-to-work laws. And what I argue is that right-to-work goes back to the Northern victory in the U.S. Civil War, when lawmakers started to frame trade unions as conspiracies that were essentially attempts to enslave free white men. There are at least three reasons that this book is different from other books about the anti-labor ethos of American politics. It's about the protagonists, the period emphasized, and the region emphasized. Okay, so most books on this topic emphasize the role of workers or judges in making a more conservative labor movement or making an anti-labor democracy. And what I argue is that if you really want to understand why we're in the space we're in right now, you have to understand the changing relationship between political parties and workers. The second major difference is the period. So folks who are writing on this topic typically go back to the turn of the 20th century, or they go to the 1930s and 40s. And what I say is that if you really want to know when all this stuff started, you need to go further back. You need to go back to the mid-19th century and the political crisis over slavery. Because you don't understand how or why the political establishment argues that trade unions are conspiracies to enslave free white men unless you understand the context out of which that argument comes, which is the Civil War, which is a war fought about slavery. Okay? The third and final difference, in my view, is that most folks who are writing about the origins of right to work emphasize the role of the South. Okay? That they say that the right to work laws originated with Jim Crow and the sort of rebellion among Southern employers to the New Deal, right? The idea is that Southerners were afraid that black and white workers would join together in unions. Okay, so let's undermine that effort. Okay, and that, you know, that's a perfectly good historical argument, and that did happen. But you know what I want to say is that these right-to-work laws actually didn't originate in the South, as much as we want to construct the South as this sort of eternal moral backwater. In fact, right-to-work laws, this sort of retrograde anti-worker legislation, originated in the North, right? And we like to think of Northerners as sort of paragons of civic virtue. But these are the folks who invented right-to-work. And you know, the book is really about how right-to-work originates with the struggle in Chicago. There are two reasons why Chicago. The first reason is that it's a key theater in the political crisis over slavery. okay? Chicago is the queen city in the home state of both Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas, the 1860 presidential nominees of the Republican and Democratic parties, respectively, okay? The Republicans chose Chicago as the site of the fateful 1860 Republican National Convention when they nominated Abraham Lincoln for the presidency. Stephen A. Douglas's residence outside of Washington, D.C. was in Chicago. He died there in June of 1861. So there are a lot of really important symbolic reasons why Chicago was at the center of the political crisis over slavery. It's not by any means the only place where that stuff played out, but it's certainly one of the better cases that you can choose to understand the role that slavery and the political crisis over slavery plays in inaugurating an anti-labor democracy. The second reason why Chicago is that Chicago supplied the vanguard of labor unrest in this period. Okay, so the first strikes for an 8-hour day happened in Chicago. Okay, in 1886, which was called the Great Upheaval, there was a nationwide wave of strikes by workers. But the strike wave was strongest in Chicago, and it led to probably the most infamous moment in 19th century labor history, which is the Haymarket Affair, when 4 anarchists were hanged for supposedly throwing a dynamite bomb at police at a rally against police brutality. Okay, and some of the greatest national labor leaders at the time were operating in Chicago. Albert Parsons, who was one of the Haymarket martyrs, was one of those leaders. And the editor of the Working Man's Advocate, which is a labor weekly, was edited by a guy named Andrew C. Cameron. And he was not just read in Chicago, where the paper was produced. He was read all over the country, right? So really for those two reasons, right, that Chicago was a key theater in the political crisis over slavery, and that it also supplied the vanguard of labor unrest in this period, those are really the two reasons why I chose Chicago. As I argued, right, the changing relationship between workers and political parties is the key thing that inaugurates this anti-labor democracy after the Civil War. And it changes over 3 phases. Okay? The first 2 phases are ones in which the political parties are able to successfully recruit, my word is articulate, successfully articulate workers into their electoral coalition. The third phase is one in which the parties completely fail to recruit workers to their electoral coalition. That's sort of like the preview. So in the early Jacksonian era, the Democratic Party is able to recruit workers into their electoral base by promising, among other things, that they will have access to cheap land. And the reason why this is enticing is because more and more workers are finding themselves being essentially wage workers, wage dependents in factories and sweatshops in the nation's cities. And that's not what immigrants came to the United States to do. They didn't want to be what they called then wage slaves. They came here to be independent men. They wanted to be farmers, or if they were going to be artisans, they wanted to own their own shops. But as it was, they were working increasingly for other people and not working for themselves. So the Democratic Party basically recruited workers to their electoral coalition through what I call a critique of wage dependency, right? You're not meant to be wage slaves. If you stick with me, I'll set you free, okay? We'll get you land out west for cheap, and you'll be able to set yourselves up, okay? So the political appeal to workers in the Jacksonian era was really about an escape from wage work. You know, it's hard to understand because in this day and age, most people work for wages. But at that time, wage work was highly stigmatized. You didn't want to be a wage worker. You wanted to get out of that situation. And so political parties were playing to that stigma. The Republican Party, in the period just immediately before the Civil War, the 1850s, makes a very similar appeal. But it is also at the same time a critique of Southern planters. And what they say is this: the South should not have the ability to extend slavery into the unsettled Western territories. Because if the South is able to do that, then they will monopolize the land. And then none of you workers are going to be able to get cheap land out west and set yourself up. You're not going to be able to be an independent farmer. So stick with me, I'll set you free. Okay? We'll continue the access to cheap land out west. And we will promise you that we will not permit the South to extend slavery into the West. So in both of these early periods before the Civil War, the political parties are appealing to workers by saying that we're with you. We think wage dependency is an evil, and it's an unnatural state for free white men to be in. So vote for me. Okay? The reason why both major parties lose workers in the period after the Civil War is because they change their tune completely. What they start to say is that freedom is about the ability for workers to exchange their labor freely on the open market with individual employers. Okay? And workers are sitting by, and many of them are veterans. They just fought in the Civil War. They come back, they're injured, you know, they got shell shocked. They went through all of this stuff, right? Fighting on behalf of the North in the Civil War. And they're listening to these guys talking about how freedom is about exchanging your labor for wages on the open market. And they say, this is a glorified version of wage slavery. Are you kidding me? This is not freedom. What happened to our land out west? What about becoming independent men? And so workers en masse completely rebel against the political parties. And when that happens, the political parties say, okay, you're not going to cooperate? Well, then we're going to use violence and all the other prerogatives of the state to crush workers, okay? If we can't persuade you, then we will control you. And one of the ways in which they did that was by using right-to-work laws to undermine the collective organizations that workers built to at least try to become independent men while also being workers in the post-bellum industrial order. Well, the main reason why the origins of right to work are relevant today is that right-to-work legislation is spreading like wildfire across the Rust Belt. Okay, so in 2012, Michigan and Indiana passed their right-to-work laws. Just this week, the Wisconsin State Senate passed their own right-to-work law. So if you want to figure out what's going on today, a good way to do that is to look back into history for where it all started, and that's in the 19th century social order. The second reason why the book is relevant for today's labor scene is that the rhetoric that conservative lawmakers use today is almost identical to the rhetoric that they used back in the 19th century. So, for example, a lot of pro-right-to-work lawmakers today talk about the individual right of workers to join or not join a union, and that right-to-work laws guarantee, okay, that those rights be protected. And back in the 19th century, people were saying exactly the same thing. I mean, they were saying, listen, you know, you can't require your fellow workers to join a union. And if you make them join a union, then you are effectively enslaving free white men. So knock it off, right? And here's a conspiracy law to prevent that from happening. Okay. Another example of contemporary rhetoric matching 19th century rhetoric is the double standard that people use to justify right-to-work laws. So back in the 19th century, both workers and employers were combining. They were forming combinations or collectives, right? As we've been talking about, workers were forming unions. That was the worker combination. And employers were also combining. They were combining into partnerships, joint stock companies, and corporations. The kicker is this. Back in the 19th century, jurists and political elites said that the worker combination was a conspiracy against individual rights, but the employer combination was a free, rights-bearing individual, a corporate person, whose rights were being violated by this conspiracy of workers, right? And you can see that double standard today, right? As I've said, conservative lawmakers out in the Midwest are saying that unions coerce workers into paying dues when they don't want to. And so right-to-work laws restores the freedom of workers to do what they want to do. Well, what is silent, in all of those arguments is the fact that there are huge, wealthy corporate backers who are funding the assault on worker rights in the Midwest. But you don't hear any of that. You don't hear about the Koch brothers and ALEC and Americans for Prosperity and all of the huge amounts of corporate donor money that goes into fighting unions out west. All you hear about is the tyranny of labor organizations, right? And how they are essentially forcing workers to pay dues. So for those two reasons, I think that the book is highly relevant, that right-to-work laws are spreading across the Midwest today, and that the rhetoric that conservative lawmakers are using now is almost identical to the rhetoric that conservative lawmakers used back in the 19th century. I wrote this book for workers and for folks in the labor movement. Not all workers are members of the labor movement or of unions, so I make that distinction. And I would say that I think I wrote this book a lot more accessibly than I did my previous book, because I want a wider audience to sort of understand what is happening. This right-to-work wildfire that is spreading across the country is undermining the power of working people everywhere. And so I don't want just sociologists reading the book. I want everybody to read the book, but especially workers and activists within the labor movement, labor educators, elected officials within the labor movement, other staff folks, organizers, activists, and rank-and-file members. But it's also written for academics. I am an academic, and so I am speaking to my peers there. And there I have in mind, comparative historical and political sociologists, sociologists of labor and of race. And I say race because you can't understand the origins of right to work unless you understand the language, the impulse behind right to work, which was about keeping free white men free, right? This is not just about class. This is also about race, okay? I also have in mind labor and political historians, and I have in mind political scientists of the American political development tradition. And I would just say I have in mind also the public at large, right? There are lots of folks who could get a lot out of this book. One group of people who comes to mind are Civil War enthusiasts. There are a lot of folks like that, okay? And a lot of that stuff is about the big battles, Bull Run and Gettysburg and so forth. And that of course is really important. It's important to document that. But that's not the only thing that's happening with respect to the U.S. Civil War. And one of the things that I want to highlight is, that the Civil War was used, okay, by politicians to undermine the power of workers. And I think that people who are interested in the Civil War would like to read a book like that. You know, I've got a lot of family, friends, and colleagues in the Chicago area and in Illinois. And, you know, this book is really about Chicago. I mean, you open that book up and you're traveling down, you know, Halsted towards the 16th Street Viaduct, where workers faced off against 20,000, you know, military personnel and police, right? That, you know, I have colleagues, for example, at the University of Illinois Chicago who are about a mile away from the Haymarket Square, okay? Folks who have that connection, that Chicago or Illinois connection, will read this book and really, I think, enjoy the history of the place they're from. But I think the largest sector of folks in the general public who I want to read this book are progressive folks, right? People who are on the side of all the marginalized people in this society, the people who are still being kicked around out there. And so I think that progressives, I would love it if progressives read this book and got something out of that.